And here we are. Okay. Actually, Pixels, let me once again mute you because I'm getting some feedback. And yeah, that was you. So when you want to speak, just unmute your mic. Okay, so today we're talking about probably the most, well, I wouldn't, I was going to say the most difficult part of Deleuze's book, but it's a better way of saying it is to say we're getting to the core of what his topic is in the second volume of Cinema. And we're going to do it by talking about his text, but also by talking about the film by Andrei Tarkovsky, Mirror, which Deleuze actually mentions in the material that I asked people to read for today. But the film is also a good illustration of stuff that he talks about in several of the chapters that I actually did not assign, but that I will be talking about as background to the material that we're going to be dealing with explicitly today. I believe that I spoke in a previous lecture about the significance of the concept of virtuality in Deleuze's work. And this is one thing that actually has sort of caught fire with people. And I think the reason why is obvious, is that the idea of virtual reality has become a significant one in our culture as computer technology is developed and as the internet is developed and as various related technologies like virtual worlds and now the Oculus Rift and so on are on the scene. People have been thinking about virtuality for a while, but Deleuze began writing about it before the personal computer revolution. And the concept in Deleuze does not really have anything to do with computation. Deleuze revives an older philosophical concept that goes all the way back to Aristotle. And Aristotle makes a distinction between actuality and potentiality. Actuality and potentiality. He sees these as two fundamental ontological concepts. In other words, they're two fundamental dimensions of being. Actuality refers to it refers to an entity that achieves full and overt presence. So to be actual means to be completely there on the scene. There's nothing left to come into existence. What is central to the thing that exists is fully present. Potentiality is the complementary concept, and what potentiality refers to is what I like to call latent being. Reality that is not overtly present, but that nonetheless is on its way. And therefore, being on its way, it has a certain ontological status. So the example that Aristotle gives, he gives a couple of them. One is the example of a seed and a tree. Or let's say, let's make it simple, an acorn and an oak. The oak is latent within the acorn. It's in the acorn potentially, but the fully developed oak is actual, and its existence as fully developed depends upon the actualization of the potential oak as the seed grows and changes. And so the concepts of actuality and potentiality are used by Aristotle to explain processes of change. So according to him, there must be something actual. I just saw Max comments. Okay, you've got to leave early to attend an artist's talk. That's fine. In order to explain processes of change, we invoke the concepts of potentiality and actuality. Whatever changes is either not currently in existence, but potentially in existence, or it's in existence in a certain state and has the potentiality of adopting another state. And so the transition from the potential to the actual is what change consists in. Another example that Aristotle gives is the block of marble and in which a statue is potentially present, but it's the sculptor who creates the actual final sculpture by altering the block of marble and by bringing out what was potential into a state of overt presence. And for Aristotle, processes of change require that something be initially actual. So actuality is the dominant concept in this pair. The reason why is that for example, in order for an oak to emerge, you have to have an actual acorn. There has to be actuality there in order for it to bear a potentiality that then becomes actual. Or in order for a statue to emerge, there actually has to be a block of marble. And there also has to be a sculptor who initiates the process of transition from the potential to the actual. Okay. Aristotle passes these concepts down to the Middle Ages, as he did most of his concepts. And so they're taken up by Catholic thinkers, but there are two in particular that broaden, I don't know how to put it, they add something to the conception of potentiality. They, in other words, they make a distinction which is no longer that of the actual and the potential. It's the distinction between the actual and the virtual. And virtuality can be read as containing potentiality within it. Or another way of putting it is to say that the potential is a form of the virtual, but it's not the only form. And so, for example, Thomas Aquinas says that if you think about a piece of marble, once again, we'll go back to the sculptor's block, earth is the primary element in the marble, but earth is mixed in with other elements, and so in order to comprise the marble. Now, earth and the other elements are present in the marble, not because they have the potentiality to become marble, they already are contributing to what marble is, but they're not actually separate entities. They don't appear as things in addition to the marble. They're contributing their powers to the marble, but without themselves appearing. And so what Aquinas says is that these qualities, these elements, exist in the marble virtually. They exist in the marble virtually. And then the other great thinker who develops the theory of virtuality is Duns Scotus, whom Deleuze actually is very influenced by. And Scotus makes the point that he deals with something that's called in the medieval tradition transcendentals. Transcendentals are concepts that characterize being without being identical with the concept of being. So, for example, goodness is a transcendental. Unity is a transcendental. Whatever has being is good. Whatever has being is one. But oneness and goodness are not the same thing as being. They wherever you have being, you've got oneness and you've got goodness, but they are not they're not synonymous with being. And so what Duns Scotus says is that the transcendentals are virtually present in being. They're virtually present. In other words, whenever you have something that you attribute being to, you must also, unquestioning, attribute goodness and unity to. But goodness and unity, although they are coextensive with being, they add something to it without being, how can I put it, salient, without being upfront, without being the focal object of your awareness. And so this idea that the virtual exists along with the actual is a significant one, because what it means is that in both the estimation of Aquinas and the estimation of Duns Scotus, the virtual is real. In other words, there's not a distinction between virtuality and reality. It's illicit for us to say that the actual is real, but the virtual is not. The actual and the virtual are both forms of reality. They both have being, or they're both dimensions of being, but they're different than one another. They're not sheer nothingness. They have an ontological substantiality about them. And so when you look at things this way, I think you have to trace the idea of virtual reality back at least to the early Middle Ages. And arguably all the way back to Aristotle. So, for example, in Second Life, which Pixels is involved with, and I've been involved with in the past, there's a distinction that's often drawn between Second Life, which is a virtual world, and the real world. The real world. People who are in Second Life actually use the abbreviation RL to refer to the real world. But philosophically, if Aristotle and Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas are right, that's an illegitimate distinction. Second Life is the real world. It's not the whole of the real world, but it's a virtual part of the real world. And so it makes no sense to distinguish between that and real life. If you want to be philosophically correct about it, you would distinguish between Second Life and the actual world, right? Actuality and virtuality, both being kinds of reality. Now, this is a very important point that Bergson rediscovers. But he rediscovers it in his analysis of, first of all, his analysis of consciousness, and then his analysis of duration in general. What's virtual, actually, let me reverse this and say what's actual for Bergson is the present moment. It's the plane that the cone intersects at. We've talked about that image many times before. It's the plane that the cone intersects. It's the actuality is the immediacy of the now that Bergson argues is just an abstraction, because there is no such thing as the immediacy of the now. And the reason why is that the now has behind it a cone of the past. And so we can think about the now as being the most concentrated point of the past. But since the now includes everything that's occurred before it within itself, it's not this sheer point. It's not this sheer line that separates past and future. It has a depth. And the depth is a depth of virtuality. Deleuze follows Bergson in saying this, but Bergson is the first one to say this. So when we have a memory, what are we doing? We're trying to call up a memory image. And the memory image is actual, Bergson says. But how do we call up a memory image? Well, first of all, we have to roam around in the depths of the virtual past. And so the example is that Bergson uses is something like, I meet someone on the street that I think that I know, but I can't remember who they are. So what am I doing? I'm searching my virtual memory. I'm looking around for that plane on which I coexisted with that person. That plane might have been my experiences in high school, or my experiences in the army, or in college, or whatnot. These are various levels of the cone. But I'm trying to find the plane where the person is located. And when I do that, I call up the image of the person in the form of an explicit recollection. The recollection image is actual, but the past that I found the person in is virtual. And so for Deleuze and for Bergson, it's impossible to understand duration without giving time its virtual dimension. In its virtual dimension is the dimension of what is not actually present at the moment, but nonetheless is implied by what's present and continues to exist, but exists in a different way than the present exists. This is the virtuality of memory, and it's the virtuality of the past. So Deleuze gets this concept from Bergson, and then he writes a couple of books in which he talks about virtuality. Virtuality plays an important role. One of them is The Logic of Sense, which is a great book. It begins with an analysis of Alice in Wonderland. And Deleuze tells us that Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland is exploring the dimension of the virtual. That once Alice passes through Well, actually, Alice in Wonderland is one book, but another book is Alice Through the Looking Glass. And I think this is more relevant to the topic today because we're going to be watching and talking about, we've watched and we're going to be talking about Tarkovsky's film Mirror. But the other book is Alice Through the Looking Glass. So Alice passes through the looking glass. On one side of the looking glass is the actual world, and on the other side of the looking glass is the virtual world. And Deleuze will tell us that the virtual world has a logic that's much different than the logic of the actual world. Now, I've spoken about this in the past, so I don't want to just go over ground that we've already covered, but it's necessary to do that as a background to the chapters that we're looking at in Deleuze's second volume of Cinema. Now, the way the concept of the virtual enters in to the second volume is that you remember that we're done with the indirect motion image in volume 2. And we're past the action image, and we're past the perception image, affection image, action image triad. Now, all film obviously involves a perception image, and so the perception image is going to remain in volume 2. But the question is, obviously, the reason why it involves the perception image is that every scene that's filmed, every frame in a movie is perceptual in character. It appeals to our senses. It makes a visual, and also if it's a talkie, it makes an appeal to our sense of hearing as well as our sense of sight. So the perception image persists throughout all film. But the question is that once the perception image is no longer linked with an affection image and an action image, once the indirect motion image is done, and it is done by the time we get to volume 2, by the time we get historically to modernist post-World War II European film, it's done. The question now is, what does the perception image link with? If it's not linking with the affection image and the action image, what does it link with? And in the chapter that I did not have you read, Deleuze says that it links with really 3 things. And in each, he gives examples from modernist European film for each of these. It links with memory, with recollections. It links with it links with memory, it links with dreams, and it links with what Deleuze calls movements of world. Now, I don't know if that's a particularly good translation. We'll just call them world movements, okay? World movements. So the perception image in modernist cinema links with memories, with dreams, and with world movements. And so what's he talking about here? Well, let's think about dreams. And so how do dreams differ from waking reality? And this is, of course, a major question, and people have been thinking about this for quite a long time. But Deleuze's conception is that, first of all, and he follows Bergson here, first of all, dreams are intimately related with memories. When one dreams, what happens is that both memories and sensations, including the sensations of the body while the dreamer is dreaming, memories and sensations are combined in a kind of world of floating blocks of perceptual content. And the connection between those blocks, the connections between those blocks are extremely fluid. So let's take an example. And Deleuze talks about, he gives a couple of examples. One is from the Buster Keaton film Sherlock Jr., and there are other examples as well. But one great example is René Clair's Entr'acte, between acts. What it refers to is the period of a break in the theatrical performance, where intermission, right, where people go out and have a cigarette or have a drink in the old days and then come back in and watch the rest of the play. Or it's in England, drinks are served and food is served in the theater. You don't even have to leave your seat. But in any event, in René Clair's film, what happens is images change into other images in relation to commonalities that the two images share. So, for example, there's a classic example of a ballet dancer who is shot from below. The woman must be dancing on a plate of glass. And so the camera is below the dancer. And what you see is as the dancer spins, the ballet dress opens and closes. It opens and closes the way the petals of a flower would open and close over time. And the legs take on the characteristic of a stem, or the plants, the stem that connects the flower with the earth. And so what happens is that the figure of the ballet dancer becomes a flower. There's a scene in the film where there's a close-up of the hair of one of the people in the film, and the hair turns into a mass of cigarettes, and then the cigarettes catch fire. There's another scene in which the two people are playing chess, and they look down at the chessboard, and the chessboard becomes the Place de la Concorde in Paris. And so you see the chessboard remains in existence, but what you see is the center of Paris popping up out of the chessboard. And so the idea here is that just as the ballerina turns into a flower, and the hair becomes a mass of cigarettes, and the chessboard becomes a scene in a city, what you've got here is the transition from one image to the other on the basis of similarities. Now, why are similarities significant? Why is association happening here? As David, you might have asked, what the supposition that Deleuze has is that we have an original experience of some kind. The original experience might be an experience of a colored field marked by striations. And in the dream, this is the initial stage of image formation in the dream. But in the dream, that basic kind of just shape that occurs in dreaming consciousness is then transformed into, let's say, a football field. In other words, a rectangle with striations, which would be the various points along the yard lines on a football field. And then the football field might turn into a birthday cake, and then the birthday cake might turn into something else that is in harmony with the original block of the original perceptual block that we've had. Now, the original image is actual, but the original image is actual only insofar as it brings into existence, Deleuze says, its successor image. And in relation to the successor image, it becomes virtual. And then the successor image is then actual, but it only really becomes actualized in a third image. And the second image in relation to the third image becomes virtual. So we have this play of virtuality and actuality that occurs throughout the length of a dream that defines the dream, according to Deleuze. Well, dream sequences are used in many films explicitly, but in films like René Clair's movie, or the films of Jean Cocteau and so forth, the Surrealist filmmakers, of course, the dream becomes the basic structure of the film. And the basic structure of the film is dreamlike. And we'll see today in Mirror, there's a great element of dreaming that is involved in the movie. And so when the perception image became detached from the rest of the indirect motion image, Deleuze says, one of the first things it did was hook up with dream imagery. Dream imagery. He calls this a large circuit. It's a circuit because the actual and the virtual are linked with one another. And on a broad scale, perception and dreaming are linked with one another. Perception, in this case, being the actual and dreaming being the virtual. But it's large scale because it has to do with the entirety of the world. There's a perceived world and there's a dreamed world. And the two are intimately connected in the films that stress the dreamlike quality of experience. There are also films that are directly linked to memory images or to recollection images. The classic example here are films that employ flashbacks. Now, Deleuze doesn't like flashbacks. He thinks flashbacks are kind of a vulgar way of treating the past, but he does identify one filmmaker whom he thinks is a master of flashback, and that is Mankiewicz. Mankiewicz made movies like The Barefoot Contessa. I'm trying to think of what else Mankiewicz made. A lot of films that you would recognize. I just don't remember what they are at the moment. But what happens in, for example, The Barefoot Contessa, Humphrey Bogart plays the male lead in The Barefoot Contessa, and Humphrey Bogart is narrating the film. And the film begins at the funeral of a friend of his who was an actress who is played by, is it Ava Gardner? I think it's Ava Gardner. And Bogart turns out to be a film director who sort of discovered this woman. And he recounts her life, but in such a way as to focus on those points at which, according to Deleuze, time forks. Time forks. And I'll talk about what forking is in a second. But not only does Bogart recount the life or recall the life of the woman whose funeral we're at, but several other characters do as well. So we have multiple flashbacks to the same film content. But the significance of the flashbacks is that they highlight those points in the past where time forked and where the woman who is now dead made a decision about which fork to take, right? It's like the Robert Frost poem, two paths diverged in a wood. You can only take one of them. But and by taking one of them, obviously you exclude the other. But the other is still there as, if you want to put it this way, a virtual option. It's an option that still exists in memory. And so many people regret having taken one fork rather than the other. And so in order to regret that, the fork that you did not take has still got to be present virtually, right? And so the point of Mankiewicz's films is to find those points of forking where time split into different potential tracts, and one of which was chosen over others. And when we think about it, of course, you can reconstruct an entire human life that way. What were the points of forking in your life where you made decisions that were fateful for the outcome of your life, but in which you had a choice about which direction to go in? And we can all come up with several of these in memory. And so Mankiewicz is an expert at doing this kind of thing in his films, and Deleuze finds this to be a perfectly legitimate use of flashback. So in Mankiewicz's movies, through the flashback, what you get is a pairing of the perception image with the recollection image. Just as in Surrealist film, you get a pairing of the perception image and the dream image. And the third kind of image that gets paired is what Deleuze calls movements of world. And he only has one director that he refers to here. And this is This is Vincent Minnelli. Vincent Minnelli, first of all, is a great colorist. Minnelli did Brigadoon. He did Gigi, a number of musical comedies. And first of all, Deleuze says that musical comedies in general have the characteristics of dreams, which is an interesting thought. I hadn't given it much thought before. It hadn't occurred to me. But if you think about it, that might be correct. He talks about, for example, the dance routines that break out in musical comedies. So let's take the example of well, actually, before we do dance, let me give you an example of what Deleuze means by movements of world by referring to Minnelli's film Brigadoon. Brigadoon is a movie about the mysterious appearance of an entire village in Ireland. And Gene Kelly, who was one of the great dancers of the period, has the lead in that movie. And so he has a unfortunate love experience, if I remember correctly, and he decides to go to Ireland, or maybe it's Scotland, I forget actually, it might have been Scotland. He goes to Scotland and he sees in the mist one morning an entire village that wasn't there the night before. And so he goes into it, and it turns out that this village, Brigadoon, appears periodically, but then disappears. But there's an entire life being lived in the village that's separate from the life that is being lived in the rest of Scotland. And so, he goes into the village and he falls in love with someone, and different events happen and so forth. This is what Deleuze calls movements of world. See, in this case, the initial perception image is of an entire world, namely ordinary Scotland. But it becomes linked with the perception image of an alternate world, in this case, Brigadoon. And so the two worlds don't communicate with one another. They're parallel to one another. When Scotland is actual, in other words, when you and I know as Scotland is actual, Brigadoon is virtual. But here's a very important point that Deleuze makes, and he makes it with all of these three forms of virtuality, of actuality, virtuality, connection. He says whenever you have an actual image and a virtual image, the two are reversible, so that the actual image becomes, after a certain point, virtual, and the virtual image becomes actual. So when we're in we're in Scotland, in the ordinary Scotland is actual and Brigadoon is virtual. But when we're in Brigadoon, Brigadoon is actual and the ordinary Scotland is virtual. So you have this perpetual reversal of the two sides. And the way Deleuze describes this is he says that the two sides are really different, but they're indiscernible. They're indiscernible. We have to assume that there is a real difference between virtuality and actuality, but we can't tell what that difference is because it depends upon what point in the history of the film or the narrative of the film that we're at, which one is going to be functioning as virtual and which one is going to be functioning as actual. They pivot around a point of indiscernibility, Deleuze says. Okay. Dance. It's interesting. He analyzes both Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, who are much different kinds of dancers. Fred Astaire is very thin, and Fred Astaire always plays the role of someone from the upper class. And his dancing is extremely elegant in character. Gene Kelly is solid. He has I wouldn't say a thick build, but he's certainly more solid than Fred Astaire is, and his dancing style is more connected to the earth than Fred Astaire's, who is more aerial in his dancing. But both of them make transitions, according to Deleuze, between different worlds, different And well, here now the concept of the world becomes somewhat hard to grasp because let me give you an example, okay? And it's a very famous scene, the song that gave the film its name, "Singing in the Rain," with Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly has fallen in love and he's outdoors on a city street and he kisses his girlfriend goodnight and it begins to rain, but he's so elated by the fact that he is in love that he throws away his umbrella or he closes his umbrella and he lets the rain, drench him as it's coming down. And as the rain is coming down, of course, it's piling up on the walkway and on the roadway, so you're getting puddles. And Gene Kelly dances as the rain is pouring down on him and as he kicks up water in the puddles as he dances. Now, what Deleuze does is he says to us, look, if you look at the way the dance breaks out, what happens is Gene Kelly begins by walking down the street. And his walk becomes more and more rhythmic in character, but he's not dancing yet. And then the dance just sort of, his walking just sort of accelerates or slightly changes its rhythm to the point where he's dancing. Now, what Deleuze says is that this is, in fact, a transition between worlds. There's the world of the ordinary city that the people who are not head over heels in love live in. And that's the world that Gene Kelly starts out in. But as the dance accelerates and as it changes rhythm, as it breaks out into a real dance, as the walk does that, the transition is made between that city and this kind of enchanted city in which rain is no obstacle. Rain becomes incorporated into the experience of elation that's present in the dance. And so once again, here we have a movement of worlds, according to Deleuze. Okay. Now, this is the background to the material that I asked you to read for today. The material on The Crystals of Time is the name of the chapter, which is a beautiful title, I think. The Crystals of Time. And this is where Deleuze begins talking about mirrors. And the talk of mirrors is really just a lead up to the idea of crystals and of crystalline structures as somehow revealing the essence of time and becoming central to the kind of filmmaking that occurs in Europe in the post-World War II period. First of all, let's take a look at the mirror. And since we're taking a look at mirrors, let's look at the film The Mirror by Tarkovsky. Mirrors are amazing things when you think about it. I mean, they played a varied role in culture, certainly. I'm sure that there's always been the question, ever since people first discovered that certain objects reflected their images back, there's got to have been always the question, what's behind the mirror? The mirror seems to give us a world that's similar to ours. But of course, it's a world in which everything is reversed. All of the signs are reversed. What's left here is what's right there, and what's right there is what's left here, and so forth. And yet there is a correlation, one-to-one correlation between objects in the real world, so-called, or let's say the actual world, and objects in the virtual world of the mirror image. This idea that there's a world behind the mirror is obviously also present in the use of mirrors in scrying or in gazing, right? You gaze into the mirror, and what are you supposed to see? Well, their mirrors are used to look into the future, the way crystal balls are used to look into the future. You see a future world. Or there's a myth, actually, among the Aztecs of one of their gods, Tezcatlipoca, I think is the name. That's got to be wrong, but it's close to the right name. He's a sorcerer, and he has an obsidian mirror. And one of the ways he uses it is to trick his opponents by showing them their image in the mirror, but what the image shows is a distortion of them. And so they see themselves as distorted, as monstrous in character, and they become depressed. And while they're depressed, I don't have it. He becomes the sorcerer god, is able to maneuver and get his will because the other god is incapacitated by this image of himself or herself as grotesquely distorted. And so the world behind the mirror in this case is a monstrous world. So in any event, this idea of what's behind the mirror, I think, is one that's been with us for a very long time. So let's take a look at Tarkovsky's film, The Mirror. Now, Tarkovsky, of course, is one of the great Russian filmmakers of the late 20th century. He had some predecessors in the Soviet Union, including Dovzhenko. Tarkovsky, of all the Soviet filmmakers, Tarkovsky really only had use for one, and that was Dovzhenko. And if you watch Dovzhenko's film Earth, you'll see that there are a lot of correspondences between Dovzhenko and Tarkovsky. In particular, their painterly and poetic approach to filmmaking. So you can, just as in Pasolini's films, you can stop the film and freeze the frame. And what you will see is an image that is very much like a painting. Same thing is true in Tarkovsky's movies. Both of them are both Pasolini and Tarkovsky are extremely conscious of composition, the composition of the still frame. In Tarkovsky's films, color is used in important ways in the movie. Also, paintings appear in his films in a kind of self-referential way. In other words, he tells us that he signals his interest in painting by having paintings appear in his film. There are particular painters or paintings that influence him. For example, in Mirror, there's a scene sort of maybe 2/3 of the way through the film where the central character in the movie is an young adolescent boy who is in training, military training, during the Second World War. And not just training, but training for immediate action, right? The Soviets enlisted adolescents in their armed forces when the Germans came in and invaded and laid siege to the Soviet Union. And so we see an image of the kid, and then the kid sort of leaves the military camp, and he rises on a hill that's snow-covered, and behind him we see a scene of a lake, a frozen lake, people skating on the lake, trees and birds against the whiteness of the snow. And anyone who knows the work of Bruegel recognizes this as very similar to Bruegel's canvases. So there's a direct reference to Bruegel in the film. And there are the references to other painters as well in Mirror. What the painterly character of Mirror does is it points to a basic characteristic of the direct time image, according to Deleuze, namely that the direct time image presents us with pure optical and sonic images, with pure optical and sonic images. In other words, once action breaks down, then perception takes over as a kind of world in itself. We're no longer interested in what in the perceptual world motivates action, because action has become impossible for one reason or another. Just as action in general becomes problematic in the post-war period, according to Deleuze. So once action becomes problematic, vision and hearing take over. And so instead of an action image, what we get is a pure optical image. And the attention to composition, the painterly character of Mirror are indications that what we've got here is a succession of optical images rather than action images. Now, since we've got a succession of optical images, we're not going to have tight narrative connections between them. Because what does narrative do? I mean, a narrative presents a story of action. A narrative is about, a conventional narrative is about what happens in the world, what situations occur that require the person who is the central characters in the narrative to respond in a certain way in order to resolve problems or to overcome obstacles or whatever. This is the conventional narrative structure. And so there you've got links between perception images. They're all subordinate to the unfolding of the story, of how the character develops, of the obstacles the character encounters, of the way the character overcomes or succumbs to the obstacles and whatnot. But when you have a succession of pure visual images, pure optical images, the connections can no longer be conventional narrative connections. And this is often responsible for the lack of patience that people have with modernist film of the kind that Tarkovsky makes. Because what people are looking for in film, usually, is narrative. And when they don't get narrative, they feel cheated. And so just as the film that we saw last week, La Ventura, just as La Ventura was booed when it was first shown at Cannes, Mirror elicited hundreds of angry letters to Tarkovsky, people from the theater audience who had seen the film and who were irate about it, and wrote into Tarkovsky telling them this. Right? The movie, first of all, Tarkovsky had a lot of trouble getting it made. He had trouble getting it through the state production agency, not for ideological reasons, but because the producers at the agency didn't understand what he was trying to do in the film. When he got the film finally released, it only stayed released for a few days. The studios recalled it because it wasn't doing very well. And the people who did see it were incensed about it, with a few exceptions. And then, of course, over time, the film began to build a critical reputation, and it's now considered to be one of the great modernist movies. And it's also won the affection of a lot of Russians. So what's actually going on in the movie? Well, there is a scenario. The scenario is that there's and this is essentially a fictionalized version of Tarkovsky himself, a poet. Actually, it's a fictionalized version of Tarkovsky / Tarkovsky's father. There's a poet who is basically dying in contemporary Russia, whatever the film was made in the 70s, right? Contemporary Russia. And the poet is reminiscing, in essence, about his life, or he's simply remembering events that occurred. But at the same time that he's remembering the events that occurred in his life, he's also remembering dreams that he's had. And so the memories and the dreams get elided with one another, so that we're often not sure whether we're in a dream or a memory sequence. And at the very end of the film, the two become completely united with one another. And the reason we know that the two are united with one another is that the earliest memory that's reported in the film is of the poet as a little boy living in his grandfather's house in the Russian forest with his mother and his little sister. And at that period, the family has been abandoned by the father. So it's just the three. It's the mother, the boy, and the girl. And then there's a series of other sequences that occur. But we then encounter at some point we encounter the mother as an old woman. In other words, the mother of the poet at the time that the poet is dying. And then in the very final scene of the film, what we see is that the mother as an old woman is projected back into the scenes of the cabin and of the poet as a little boy and his with his little sister. So in other words, instead of an appropriately aged mother, a mother who let's say is around the age of 30, what we have now is a mother who's around the age of 70, but with the two young children in the in the woods at the same time that the opening scene was dated. And then we see in the background, and it's easy to miss this, we see in the background the mother at the age of 30 looking at the mother at the age of 70, along with the two young children. So obviously it's impossible to parse this as either memory or dream. It's got elements of memory, it's got dream elements, and the two of them are mixed inextricably. But in the other parts of the film, it's not impossible to distinguish between dreams and memories. For example, one of the great dream sequences, well, there are really two in this movie, marvelous dream sequences. In one of them takes place early in the film. The father is left. We don't see the father at that point. The father has left, and the children and the woman have been abandoned. The kids miss their father, in particular the son. And the son at that point is about maybe 4 years old, around then. And he's in bed, and he hears something. He hears something coming from his parents' bedroom. The father's gone at that point. And he sits up in bed, and he thrusts his body forward a little bit, and he gets up, and he looks into the bedroom, and what he sees is the face of his father. And the father has a ladle that he's used to scoop up water, and he's pouring it over the head of his wife, she's washing her hair in a basin, and her hair, her long hair, is falling down in front of her face, and wet, streaming wet with the water. And then Tarkovsky does something that he does in a number of scenes. He shoots it in slow motion. But because the movements are subtle anyway, it's very easy to miss the slow motion. In other words, this is not a slow motion train, right? It's a slow motion of people who would be moving slowly in any event. But the slow motion tends to stretch out time. It gives us the sense that this is really, how can I put it, discontinuous from the tempo of the rest of the film. And then we see, as you see her face, and here once again, the painterly character of the image is striking. When you see her face covered with her hair and the hair dripping wet, her body begins to almost to float. Her arms sort of float upward, and the camera moves back to a distant shot or a medium shot. And then we see the ceiling of the house begin to crumble as water runs down the walls and drips from the ceiling, and these big sheets of paint peel off of the ceiling and fall down as the water is carrying. In other words, the house is in the process of disintegration. It's easy to read that image. This is what's happening in the mind of the little boy. His family has been disrupted, is breaking down, and so what we see is this image, this dream image of the house breaking down. But the whole thing is done in such an incredible way. There's no way to mistake it for reality, or even to mistake it for a memory. When you watch this, it's clearly a dream image that we see. And the other great dream image occurs later in the film, and it's a famous one. It's a dream image, and once again, the father and the mother are present in their bedroom, and the father is stroking his wife's hand. We see this in a close-up at the beginning of the scene. And then as the camera backs away, we see that the wife is on her back with her eyes closed, as though she were asleep. But her hair is hanging down into space. And as the camera backs up, we see that until it gets a full image of her, we see that she is floating above her bed. It's a levitation scene. And she remains asleep. And her husband is sort of being very tender, in his relationship with her at that point. It's a short scene, but it's a gorgeous scene, visually and emotionally. It's a gorgeous scene. So we have these dream elements in the film. But we also obviously have memory elements. Now, what does mirror mean here? There's an obvious scene that's got a mirror in it, and it's the scene that occurs after the initial sequences that take place in the grandfather's house in the countryside. What we see is the young mother, the 30-year-old mother, look after a few motions of her body, almost dance-like motions of her body, she ends up looking into the mirror. But what she sees is herself at the age of 70. And she reaches her hand out. And we know it's her hand because her hand is not wrinkled. There are no signs of age. She reaches her hand out and touches the mirror as her 70-year-old self reaches her hand out and touches the mirror, so that the two hands are superimposed. And then there's a cut, and we are now in the apartment of the boy who is now a poet in his 40s. And so the mirror in this case is the mirror. It's like the mirror in Alice Through the Looking Glass. It's the mirror that is the passageway between two worlds. You know, there's the world of the past, which was, by the way, the world of the present until we see the image of the old woman in the mirror. The world, what is now the world of the past, is connected through the mirror to the world of the present. But remember, the world of the present from the vantage point of the past was the world of the future. And since we took the original recollection of the house in the countryside and so forth to be the present, it's that world that's actual initially. The world on the other side of the mirror is virtual. But once the camera focuses on what's going on behind the mirror in the present, in the 70s, right? Then the world of the past becomes virtual, and what was on the other side of the mirror becomes actual. So in other words, once again, we've got this reversal that occurs between the virtual and the actual, and the mirror is the point of indiscernibility around which this transition happens. Oh, I should just point out to one other scene, which I think is worth paying attention to, and that is before the mirror plays that role. The family barn burns to the ground, but it burns in the middle of a rainstorm, and it's a beautiful scene. You know, it mixes fire and water in this incredible way, along with the image of the young mother seated on a well after she washes her face in the well water. She sits and watches the barn burn. There's some worry that a child is caught in the barn, although that turns out to be not the case, and so forth. And it's just an amazing scene that goes on for about 3 or 4 minutes. We find out on the other side of the mirror that in the present, in what is now the present, the poet is divorced, but he's divorced from a woman who is the spitting image of his wife at the age of 30. And the reason why she's the spitting image is that the two women are played by the same actress. This isn't done intentionally by Tarkovsky. So it becomes easy to confuse his wife with his mother, for us to confuse his wife with his mother, because they look exactly the same. And it's even remarked by the wife, that she resembles his mother to an astonishing degree. There's a boy in the present, in the 1970s, who is the Tarkovsky character, the poet's boy, his son, and the son of his wife. And there's some question about the boy moving from living with his mother to living with his father. And so we know that there's been a divorce here. Okay, there's stuff that happens there. Then we go back to the past now, and we see the young mother working in a Soviet print for the Soviet printing agency, and she's got to worry about having made a mistake in transcribing a manuscript, and so she frantically goes back to work to find the manuscript and so forth, and some things happen there. Nothing very spectacular happens in any of this, but now the dreams, the memories begin to become mixed with documentary footage. And the documentary footage is footage from the Second World War to the point where the film moves us into the present. And we've got, for example, footage of a Russian military unit returning from the war. We've got footage of a hot air balloon event. It seems to be a military event, but using gigantic hot air balloons. And that's another amazing painterly image. You watch that scene. We've got footage of the Sino-Soviet border dispute in the late 1960s. And so we've got documentary footage that covers the entire period that separates the boy from the man, the period of time. And other things occur as well. I'm not going to describe them all, because to describe them all really is to once again simply describe the various relatively disjoint, pure visual images, pure optical images, and of course there's also the sound is also significant in the film. Bach is played both in the beginning and at the end. At the end, it's the St. John Passion by Bach that's played, and there are other things that occur sonically that are significant. But basically, it's a series of optical images, loosely connected, without real narrative continuity, but connected in accordance with the logic of memory and the logic of dreaming. And then moving to a point of, as Deleuze would have said, indiscernibility, not only between the actual and the virtual, but between memory and dream. And this is what the film is about. There's no other way to characterize it. So when we're describing it, we can't tell the story that the film tells, because no story is told in the film. Or stories are told, but they're told in disjoint fragments. In the way in which stories are told in the memories that we have of events. That and when our memories are moving quickly from one to another, when we just sort of meander in the past, as we sometimes do. And of course, the narratives in the dreams are dream narratives, so they're short and their significance is unclear, and there's certainly no action going on, or no action that could be treated in a narrative fashion. And so here we are now. We've made the break from the action image to or from the indirect time image, of which the action image is the representative, to the direct time image. And why the direct time image? Well, remember that in Bergson's conception of time, which Deleuze accepts, the past, and for Bergson, dreaming activates the past, along with other things. The past is not organized in sequence. There's no narrative line that connects all of the elements of the past. The past is, in the past, every moment that we've experienced is simultaneously present, along with every other moment that we've experienced. It's present in layers, in layers of expansion and contraction, the most contracted being the point of the present. But nonetheless, we don't have a sequence, we don't have a narrative line. What we've got is the coexistence of all of these planes of experience. And so when we roam among them, we're not following narrative lines. We're not following sequences or reconstructing sequences. We're moving in a kind of floating fashion. Yeah, that's when I was a boy, and I remember my grandmother was there. And oh yes, my grandmother, when she was older, did something similar. And then of course, you know, my mother was present, and I remember going. You know what I'm saying? It's you could call it free association if you want, but that doesn't really get at it because Deleuze is not talking about a particular technique here. He's talking about the way memory is, or the way virtuality is. And so the film adopts the logic of that, the logic of memory, the logic of dream, the logic of the indiscernible actual virtual pair. Now, let me just, I'm not going to talk a whole hell of a lot longer, but let me just try to bring this up to the question of the crystalline structure. What's a crystal? Well, a mirror image for Deleuze is the simplest version of a crystal. For Deleuze, a crystal is a, I don't know whether you would want to call it a metaphor or not. I'm not quite certain about that. But it's an image, it's a concept that's meant to evoke this essential, indiscernible two-sidedness between the virtual and the actual. And the reason why he calls it a crystal is crystals have facets, obviously. And so there has to be at least two facets for there to be a crystal. And the mirror, he's stretching the point here, right? The mirror has two facets. It has, you know, the behind the mirror, the in front of the mirror, the virtual and the actual. But crystalline structure is more complex than the mirror because the crystal has a tendency to expand into a polygon, Deleuze says. So not just two faces, but multiple faces. You know, 5, 6, 7, 8 faces. Think about a quartz crystal. And not only that, but the crystal begins as a seed. So you know how you create a crystal, you supersaturate a solution, and then you have something that enables the solution to sort of coagulate around it, and that's the seed, and then the seed, out of the seed, a crystal grows. And so you also have the crystal as a seed that tends to impregnate its environment so that the environment itself becomes more and more crystalline. Now, what's he getting at here? Well, he says that what the crystal really is the place in which we have the most direct image of time. And how come? Well, remember that for Bergson, time has an actual and a virtual character to it. For Bergson, there are two streams of time. One stream is the stream of time in which the present sinks into the past. The other stream of time is the stream of time in which the future moves into the present. Now, the stream of time in which the future moves into the present, you could think of as actual. In other words, the present is the point of actuality that anticipates a future. And when the future arrives, it itself becomes actual. It becomes the present. But remember that for Bergson and for Deleuze, there is no present that is not already past. The present as seeking into the past is the present as always belonging to the virtuality of memory. And so what we have here are two faces of time. They're different. You know, it's not that time is a single line of succession. It's the intersection of these two very different lines, these two very different processes. One of which is virtual, one of which is actual. But of course, you can reverse it as well, so that the present as it sinks into the past can be interpreted as actual, and the present that's connected to the future, since the future hasn't happened yet, can be interpreted as virtual. Once again, you've got this indiscernibility of the two sides. So what the crystal does is it allows us to see the structure of time in a multiplication of virtual actual planes. Can we give some examples here? Well, he says he's not talking about the crystal in a scientific sense. He says he's talking about the crystal as an aesthetic structure. as a structure that allows us to analyze film, basically. And so, what's an example of a crystalline image? Here, he makes a kind of obvious reference, and he refers to the globe in Citizen Kane that Orson Welles is holding at the beginning of the film. Orson Welles is on his deathbed. Kane is on his deathbed. And he's got a globe, and the globe is one of those spheres that's filled with snow. And so you turn it upside down, and then you turn it right side up, and you see a scene in which it's snowing. You know the ones I'm talking about. And when Kane dies, the globe falls out of his hand and rolls onto the floor, and it smashes. And the way the camera shoots this is that when the globe smashes, we see the snow in the globe. It's as though the camera were entering into the fragmenting globe. We see the snow coming at us. And then what happens? The scene changes. And it's snowing. But it's snowing in an environment, once again, a rural environment where Charles Foster Kane is now a boy. And he's on his sled. And so I won't, for people who haven't seen Citizen Kane, we're going to be seeing it. I won't tell you the significance of the sled here. But what Deleuze says is that obviously, once again, we've got these two sides, right? We've got the world in which Kane is dying. We've got the world in which Kane is still alive as a boy. The globe is the crystal that connects the two sides. Depending upon which side you're on, it's either actual or virtual. Once again, the two sides are reversible. But he also says that in this case, the globe is like a crystalline seed, because when the globe smashes and we see the snow coming out, and then the scene changes, what's happened is that the entire environment has crystallized. In other words, the seed has propagated from the globe to the entire world that is now snow-covered in the past. And so we've got these two aspects of the crystalline structure. He uses the concept of the crystal more metaphorically too. There's a movie by Renoir, the French filmmaker Renoir, and so the film is called The Rules of the Game. It's a wonderful film. It takes place in the countryside in which an elite, actually I think a titled person, a member of the French aristocracy, is giving a party. And in this film, everyone is extremely sophisticated. So the main couples are having affairs with other people and with the knowledge of their partners. And this is sort of a stereotype about France, right? Nothing is fazing them. So your wife is having an affair with another man. Well, you've got your mistress too, and so it's all very sophisticated kind of thing. So there are at the party there are a number of such pairs, and so each pair links up with all the others. In other words, what you get is a correlation of men with men and women with women in these love triangles, that each of which is the reflection of all the others. With one exception, and because in all of these triangles, the shenanigans of each person are accepted, with one exception, and that is there's a triangle that involves a maid, a groundskeeper, or actually it's not really a groundskeeper, it's a maid and someone who's just been hired, kind of a vagabond who's just been hired to work in the kitchen, and then her husband who is a groundskeeper. But the husband does not accept the rules of the game. This is the significance of the title. And so the husband becomes very jealous over his wife's relationship with the guy who's working in the kitchen. And so he decides that he's going to kill him. And he shoots the person whom he thinks is his wife's lover. But in actual fact, he kills the lover of the woman who is married to the aristocrat hosting the party. And so what Deleuze says is that the film is a crystal that has a flaw. And the flaw is the groundskeeper who doesn't accept the rules of the game. And when the flaw actually forces the crystal, what happens is when the flaw reaches a certain stage, the stage of the shooting, the crystal breaks. And this is, in other words, this world that's been constructed in which everybody had a place and everything mirrored everything else is now in pieces. And so he uses the crystalline. And he does this in his analysis of several movies. Now you have to decide whether or not this is a legitimate use of the concept of the crystal. And does it really refer back to Deleuze's theory of time? Does it make sense of the relationship between the virtual and the actual? And are these films actually playing on the relationship between the virtual and the actual? I think these are all legitimate questions to raise. But my own feeling is that there's something going on here, that Deleuze is onto something. He might be pushing it here or there, but I do think that this conception of the virtual actual pair in which the two sides are indiscernible, its connection with dreaming, its connection with memory, its connection with what he calls movements of world, the idea that that reversible image can be a seed that then grows to shape an entire environment. I think all of this is actually insightful, even if it's sometimes carried a little bit too far. In any event, it's the framework that he applies to Mirror, and of course he sees Mirror as a crystalline film, as a film that presents us with crystals of time. And I think that's it. I think that's all I'll say about it, which is a mouthful. Mac, I know you've got to go. Do you want to say anything before you have to take off? Your mic is muted, so you'd have to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Well, the only thing I would have to add is that I read one kind of short review that said that the guy who is dying is actually kind of, as he looks back on his life, he's kind of mirroring what happened in Russia during the time. So I'm not. I can't really. Well, I think that could be correct. I don't know the Russian history well enough to really say how he's doing that, but
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's certainly something to that. The documentary footage suggests that. And Deleuze actually himself says that the same question is being asked again and again in Mirror, namely, what is Russia?
Uh-huh.
And so, and it's certainly true. Tarkovsky himself was sort of a dissident. He wasn't politically active, but he was not a fan of the regime. And he ended up dying in Italy. He went to Italy to make a film, and then he never left. And he was sad about not leaving. He missed Russia. He wanted to be back in Russia. He died rather young too. Yeah, I do. And and Tarkovsky lived through the Second World War, through the aerial bombing, through the evacuations. We see evidence of this in the documentary footage in the film. He certainly was aware of the border dispute between the Soviets and the Chinese, as everybody else was at the time. It was a major event. The scene of the Russian soldiers returning from the war, is really the scene of his father's unit returning from the war. Oh, and I forgot to mention this, is that in the film, the father does come back to the family. He comes back to the family after the war in a soldier's uniform. And he's reconciled with his wife. He seems to be reconciled with his wife. We see this fascinating scene in which his children reunite with him, in which the boy has a look of almost terror on his face, holding on desperately to his father. So the details of Tarkovsky's life, as all of our lives, the details of our personal lives are interwoven with the details of history. And so, and I think he does try to do that through the use of documentary footage. So I can see, and I think that's a perfectly valid way of looking at the movie. Tarkovsky made many films. Well, I guess maybe not many films. Actually, now that I think about it, he didn't make a whole hell of a lot of movies, but he made great films. Every film by Tarkovsky is, in my estimation, a masterpiece. Stalker, Solaris. There was a remake of Solaris, an American remake recently. It was much poorer than the Tarkovsky film. Solaris is a science fiction novel. It was based on a science fiction novel by Stanislav Lem. Nostalgia, which is the last film Tarkovsky made. And what's interesting about that film is that the central character in the film is dying, and does die in the movie. And they say that the poet, the critics, or the material that I've read too, Mac, says that the poet in Mirror is on his deathbed. But it's not clear to me that this is a deathbed. He's certainly ill. But at one point, the doctor seems to say to him, "Why don't you get up and visit your mother?" So you wouldn't say that to a man who's on his deathbed. So I don't know. I don't really understand that scene very well. Tarkovsky's father was a well-known poet, well-known Russian poet, and the poetry in the movie is Tarkovsky's father's poetry. The figure on the bed, the figure, the Tarkovsky of the future, is a poet. So this is why I say the character is an elision between Tarkovsky and Tarkovsky's father. Generationally, the character is the same age as Tarkovsky, but the poet aspect is a reference to his father. What other tidbits about the film can I tell you? It's one of those films that bears watching again and again. But in order to appreciate it, in the same way that in order to appreciate La Ventura, you've got to forget about narrative, right? You have to forget about your ordinary way of watching a movie, and you have to sit there and let yourself drift with it. If you get into this kind of mindset in which the kind of mindset that you're in when you muse about the past, you wander, you meander around in the past. If you're able to maintain that mindset, then you can appreciate the film for what it is. And the other way to focus on it, of course, is to focus on what I think is its astonishing visual beauty. Because Tarkovsky is a master. He obviously has cinematographers working for him, but it's his imprint that's on every one of his films. He's a master cinematographer. And so I would look at the movie in those two ways. Otherwise, you'll just be like the Russian audience that sent him angry letters.
What would you say about if somebody made a movie where the character in the film watches old movies of themselves? Would that be a crystallization type of concept?
Oh yeah.
So where the whole film would have been a person watching movies of themselves.
It's a fascinating idea, and I would certainly say that. In a sense, any imagery can be seen as virtual. Painting, including works of art, painting, sculpture, photography, film. I think in other words, all these things are not the real world, and yet they're connected to the real world in some fundamental way.
But in a sense, it's like somebody looking at, like you said, the sculpture doesn't exist. When the sculpture finally exists, it becomes actual. Correct?
That's right.
Okay, so if the sculpture is so the film that you're watching of yourself from the past, it's still an actual thing.
Yes.
So, but it's also the past being, bringing up those memories that are in that, that you recall. So I mean, I think there's a weird, I was just trying to figure out how that balances, where the film itself that you're looking at is a real, actual thing, but the images are shot from another time.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead, Mac.
Well, but it seems like in film it's almost part of its nature not to be that actual, because it's just a projection on a screen and it's always changing. So, I mean, as far as having a film in a can, then it's actual. But it seems to kind of try not to be that actual or something.
Well,
Right, but a film is a story being told. If you're just looking at actual footage of your life as it was recorded or video, it's it's just an interesting idea. I wonder how Deleuze would have looked at that concept if somebody made a movie of just that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fascinating idea. You know, think about it. I mean, you're talking about film, let's say home movies. It's really what you're talking about, right? You're talking about a film of
Yes.
someone watching home movies of themselves. And now we've got, because people are carrying around cell phones and so forth, smartphones, we've got people taking video of everything. And so everything is being recorded in some way or another. So you're sitting and you're watching videos of that. And what are you doing? I mean, are you seeing something? You're seeing something certainly that was at least a visual. It's at least a visual interpretation of something that was once actual, or a visual rendition of something that was once actual. You were actually there, and the films are being made.
You're in the film.
You're in the film. Yeah. And so there's a past actuality there. But if you are really absorbed in the film, then you're looking at. Basically, what you're trying, I would think that what you're trying to do is you're trying to reconstruct your view of the world when the film was made. It's strange actually watching ourselves in home movies, because we're no longer at that point in our lives, and yet the task is to somehow project ourselves into these foreign people who just happen to be us.
I also wanted to bring up a film that was very interesting. That is, I don't know if it falls into this category or not, but just suggest it. It's called The Congress, and it was made about I think 2012 or so forth. So if you can find it, it's a very, very strange film, but it does deal with the concept of virtuality in the sense that Robin Wright plays herself as an aging actress who is no longer getting roles.
Mm-hmm.
And Harvey Keitel plays her agent, and he approaches her with this, contract for this new production company that is creating virtual reproductions of actors and actresses. And, she needs the money because her son has a hearing problem. And so what happens is you sign a contract, and during the length of the contract, she can't do anything. She can no longer act. She can no longer do any roles, anything. But her entire self, her identity, will be captured as this virtual character, like an avatar of herself. And then they can use it however they want. So she will stay forever at the age she is recorded, and for the next 20 years of her contract. And the film then kind of switches into a really kind of a surreal animation, Bakshi almost style animation, in which she tracks down at the end of her contract, to find out, what has happened with the production company and so forth. So it moves, it's very strange, but that idea of capturing oneself, it's fascinating, because we actually are moving in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
With technology. And I was just posted some stuff on my Facebook page about robotics and so forth, how they're becoming more and more lifelike. Mm-hmm. And the idea and basically what made me think again about the Congress was reading an article about a guy who made a robot that himself, his own little personal project to look like Scarlett Johansson, because he's obviously infatuated by her, which is really disturbing, you know. But the idea of that, and then what happens when, you know, but if you in that film itself, when she gives up her identity, and then all of these films actually represent isn't her in the film. It's just, and then to be watching yourself, but it's not actually you. It's and it's not a filmed. It's not you being filmed in a character role. It becomes a virtual recreation of who you are as that actress in a film.
Yeah.
So but it's a fascinating movie. I highly recommend it because it's like nothing you've probably ever seen.
I read a description of this movie. I recognized it when you were talking. It does sound fascinating. Yeah.
And it kind of, the whole idea, again, going back to when you talk about the virtual and the, you know, the actual and the virtual, I think it really just blows that whole thing up from the concept of the movie itself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, giving somebody the rights to your complete, you know, identity to use that. And then again, as you mentioned, with everybody using cell phones and recording everything that everybody sees every minute, you know, even selfies, whatever, you're kind of giving up your identity, you know, or, which I don't think, personally, I believe that people need permission always to use your identity, no matter how it's used. You know, somebody takes a picture of me, I want to know where's it going, and if I don't like it, man, they're not going to use it.
Well, good luck with that one.
You know, and I wondered then if you could actually copyright or trademark yourself to the extent where then if somebody does that, you can actually sue, because they're violating because you're unique. Apparently your DNA makes you unique from every other person. So I was actually considering that's something interesting, you know, that has anybody tried to do that yet either. I'm going to look into it. But again, this idea of taking, you know, of virtual and actual is becoming something when in the real world of being split up, where you can take, you know, somebody's image now and apply it even through simple technology that's out there and create animated films or whatever.
Yeah, certainly right about that. Look, films are not the final art form that's going to come along as a result of technological innovation. That's for sure. And what you're talking about is on its way. It's not already here. I agree with you. When you were talking about the guy who was built Scarlett Johansson, there's a movie, what's it called? Ex Machina, which is about, it's sort of like I don't know, what's the name of the Steve Jobs kind of guy, who, you know, or a genius, right? A high-tech genius who's fabulously wealthy and who's developed the technology to create conscious machines, and they're all women. They're all beautiful women. Have you seen the movie? Anybody? It's worth seeing, I think. I don't remember the name of the director, but it's an interesting. And of course, there's a lot of discussion about this now, and a lot of representation in film about what happens if you have a machine that's fully intelligent, or, you know, what is the nature of personal identity? Is it possible for a machine to have a personal identity? Is it possible for a machine to have rights? All this kind of stuff is coming up. But clearly, before we get to any of that, we're going to have modes of art making that are hooked into the kind of technologies that you're talking about, Pixels. I muted you again, by the way, because you were bleeding through to my side. So if you want to talk, Pixels, you got to unmute your mic.
Yeah, I was going to say that augmented reality will become a thing where you can actually alter your perception by including images that don't exist in your real world. So then that's where things become even more the crossover between, or the merging perhaps, of real and virtual. So you are looking at your environment in your living room, but you can have, you know, dinosaurs, you know, wrestling in your, you know, carpet, you know, or you know, or be having, you know, things in your house that don't exist.
Right.
in your environment. And I think that's interesting too. And then of course that probably will have some capability of being recorded as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are already such apps for smartphones, augmented reality apps. I mean, the technology isn't very souped up yet, but it's going to be. Already, you've got apps for kids where they can see, dinosaurs playing on their rugs. Yeah.
Well, they also have the other thing that's kind of up that line, and I posted stuff on my Facebook page so I can go back and find it. I don't use Facebook socially. I use it as a place to store information for the most part, and just share it with people. But they did finally figure out kind of I think it deals more with I don't know if it's actual projection. I think again it's augmented reality, but it's video conferencing like we're doing now, but where the person actually beams into your space.
Oh yeah, I've seen that too. Yeah, kind of like almost a holographic thing.
Yeah, it's almost holographic. I mean, Ben, who my friend, in England, who's worked with us in Second Life, we've talked about this a lot in how you'll be able to do holograms, and it's the idea of projecting. The projection problem is the issue because the projection needs to hang on to like a solid object.
I think it's just an advance in that. I think I read something in a tech magazine about that. Didn't someone just come up with a method of three-dimensional projection that is about to be marketed?
I don't know how it's.
Hi, Mac. Mac left.
Okay. I don't know how they can do it in the sense of because a projection image, it needs something to cling to. Like I think when Andrew Burrell was doing that thing with the tweets, he had to use that box full of smoke or something.
Yeah, and I think
to project on because he needed some more solid that they could.
Yeah, and I think this method does use something like that, something like vapor particles or something as a foundation for the projection.
Yeah, because I think I talked about it links with Ben, and he's pretty advanced in that technology, and we could never figure, But then I suggested because he was looking at a project that they try using bubbles. And to see how that would be interesting to use if you had a corridor filled with bubbles with projection, several small projectors hitting them with images.
Yeah.
And he wasn't sure that they would still reflect, but if they were filled with smoke bubbles, which you could create, that they might actually then be able to hold an image.
Right.
Getting off topic, but No.
I think in a way, all this technological advance is a kind of almost a step into the past. Think about it. The cave paintings are virtual. They're not real buffalo or they're not real horses on the wall of Lascaux. They're virtual horses and virtual buffaloes. And it's just that our technology has become very sophisticated.
Well, I think I'm going to say Ray Bradbury, nailed it many years ago in his short stories when he did the one about the African savannah that the kids run off into, and when they lived in an environment where they had the virtual playgrounds, and then Star Trek picked that up later, as their holodeck or whatever they called it. So you could recreate literally what would be, although in Bradbury's version, it was actually real enough where I guess the lions could kill you.
Right. Well, I don't know whether you know this, but the guy who really invented modern virtual reality, what was his name now? I'm getting so bad with names. In any event, he was a technician, a technologist, an engineer, I think. But he's the one who developed the goggles and motion feedback system that's now the Oculus Rift is now using.
It's like Yanir or something. Linear.
Yanir was one of them, but this guy was before Yanir. It'll come to me. But in any event, he wrote a paper on this, and in which he talks about he describes the holodeck before it existed, but without the safety device on, right, that prevents things from actually happening, bad things from actually happening. So he talks about creating a computer simulation that is so perfect that a virtual bullet fired at you in such an environment would kill you, right? Kind of thing. So yeah, and I think that, and Bazin, Andre Bazin, the French film theorist, wants essentially that too. He sees film as a halfway station to the development of the final, perfected version in which all sense modalities will be created in a world that's basically indistinguishable from the actual world.
Well, you remember the old film, and I think they did a remake of it called Westworld.
Oh yeah.
The fantasy where you got to go in and until it basically.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and you went into the old, and they were robots, but again, they could, the actual stuff would happen, and I think that's and that's been addressed in a lot of films. I mean, that kind of, but I think that's the idea of being interactive, and I think that was also in Fahrenheit 451, where the wife spent her time watching the interactive soap operas.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was part of that too. That Bradbury always kind of had this really wonderful, unique vision. But I see that happening now. The whole idea where you would go maybe into a theater, and the film would be, or I guess it would, be like a video game, but you would actually be physically present in it somehow. And not just an avatar.
Interactive for each individual, or what, like Second Life, or what? What do you have in mind?
I'm worried. I don't think you would be. I think this takes it into where the merging of the two, where the environment is somehow so projected that it feels like you can move through it. Mm-hmm. But you're not an avatar. You're actually yourself. You're not wearing goggles or some device. You're actually walking. So basically like walking through the museum, only everything is is real or happening. It's virtual, but it feels like it's actually happening around you.
Right. Well, when you get that developed, let me know, because I'll buy it.
Well, I think that's a direction people are headed in. The idea of having a fully interactive experience, not just as an avatar where you're still separated from the experience, but you're seeing it through your eyes, but you're not actually feeling all the, and you don't have to wear a special suit to have the sensations or wherever else. It's just actually it will happen. It's like going, in a sense, you could say going to Disneyland or someplace like that is sort of that, but it's not a narrative story. It's not a created film environment. Those are just things that you experience, and you go into the hokey little rides like Snow White or something like that, and you get the story told around you. But it'll be interactive, where actually your actions will affect the direction of the story.
I can imagine that. That's not even that far away. Some version of what you're talking about.
I mean, it happens now with gaming. Really sophisticated gaming is getting to that point. Of course, you do something happens. They've developed, several different forks, as you would say, mm-hmm. that, based on the actions that you take, that then you can go on to those different directions.
Yeah. Well, my view is that photography and film were the first forms of new media art. Because they were the products of industrial technology and impossible before the development of chemistry, for example, and to a certain extent the development of optics. And so the stuff that you're seeing now with computers, and it's an extension of that, but it's not fundamentally different. And so you could say all of this as variations on a common theme.
Yeah, I mean, and again, going back to what I was saying, watching your childhood movies, sitting there and just watching your, if I have my entire childhood on film. My father was a filmmaker in that regard. About this
when you were talking, because I mean, you've got a ton of archival footage. And
I mean, if I linked it if I could figure out the chronology of all of it and put it all together, it would be like our lives told. But imagining that with future technology, where you would have recorded all of these things and you could go back and somehow actually experience them.
Well, why bother trying to reconstruct the original narrative of your life when nobody lives in accordance with the narrative anyway? Adopt Tarkovsky's method. Float.
Well, yeah, or just, but the idea would be to, re-experience some of perhaps those things that, to have those sensations, those, like again, the most powerful thing, if they wanted to in film, or any media, the most powerful sense that we have is smell. It can pull back everything into memory for some reason, more so than looking at something. Your eyes can be a little deceptive, people change, hearing, whatever, but the sense of smell can bring back emotions.
You know about the Sensorama? Have you heard of that?
The old movies where they have scratch cards?
No.
Oh no. Okay.
A Sensorama was it was an arcade installation. It wasn't a game though. It was a form of virtual reality that included smell as well as they tried to have, including feeling, but the feeling was the feeling of wind blowing on your face. They used a fan for that, and then they had I forget what the various scenes were, but they tried to implement all 5 sense modalities in a virtual reality setting. This was before computers, by the way.
This is called Sensorama?
Sensorama. Yeah,
so would it be like an individual little pod or something you'd sit in?
Individual, almost like a arcade game console, like we would see now in a video game console, except it wasn't a video game. It was pre-digital, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
So analog. That sounds actually really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it would be. I mean, that could be really fun. I mean, if you incorporate now with I just posted something where another company has come up with a new goggle that does something where it actually tracks your eye movements.
Oh right, yeah.
And it's supposed to help get rid of the seasickness or motion sickness that people experience wearing the headsets.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess if you could combine that, and you have your leap motion, also where you can move things around, but apparently it's supposed to give you, if you combine that with with the same environment you're talking about, where you could sit in some sort of a console chair that would be able to, shoot out different olfactory, for your olfactory senses, and have different kinds of maybe, like you said, wind blowing or sounds or something like that. It could be, that could be actually really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, they're taking, again, they're using that technology, who will jump on that. It always will be the people that will do it will be entertainment will get there. Adult entertainment always gets there about the same time military does. For some reason, there's been a correlation. I've seen this over the years. As soon as something like, hey, the military has been using flight simulators, and then somehow the adult world has been finding their sort of version of using that technology.
Yeah, right.
But entertainment. But I can see that coming. It just also gets back to the idea of where people become just, aware what happens to imagination.
Well, presumably you have to be making these things, or obviously that there are ways of stimulating people's contribution and imagination, even in virtual worlds. Content creation, all kinds of things can happen.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah,
that's not the big entertainment stuff that you've been talking about.
See, I don't think it takes imagination to play a video game.
Yeah.
It's all laid out for you. I mean, you make choices, and it's more about, most of them are like shooter games or whatever. So you're just trying to, perfect your movement through a space and your ability to hit a target and get to a certain level. And you might be given information. I haven't seen any, other than more children's games that teach things about building skills and, things that are like learning skills. But I haven't really, but Second Life is a perfect example of using imagination by being provided tools to be able to create with. But most of the entertainment, like you said, like even the film, I haven't seen the film The Mirror, but I'll watch it after this, having hear you talk about it, I think it requires a certain amount of imagination to watch that movie.
Yeah, right.
And I don't see that in a lot of films or a lot of entertainment, that you have to, there's a certain leap of faith you have, in going into a film, but still it's someone else's imagination being fed to you.
There is a neo-Marxist philosopher, German philosopher, Theodor Adorno, who's been dead for quite a while, since 1968. But he made a distinction between what he called the culture industry and art. And his version of art was always avant-garde art. But the distinction was between art objects that are effortless to consume, that those are the products of the culture industry, and art that requires the active engagement of the spectator, the listener, or whatever, in order to figure out what's going on, in order to sort of construct the piece as it's evolving. And yeah, I think that's a valid distinction.
So,
listen, it's time to wrap up, and I've got to go. I've got papers to grade. Oh my God, I can't tell you.
Are you still recording?
We're still recording.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to mention I did give you a link. I did give you a link there that I just ran across, and it was like, it's old. It's from 2010, so I don't know if all the links work.
Culture, Tarkovsky. Okay.
Yeah, they were like a list of. They said you could watch Tarkovsky films for free.
Wonderful.
So
yeah, free now online. Very good. Okay. It was good seeing you again, Pixels. It was good having Mac here. And we're doing next week. We are doing what is it? We're doing last year at Marienbad, which is another one of the great avant-garde films. So did I lose you? I think I lost.
I'm still here. I turned it off when you're talking.
Okay. So in any event, I'm gonna sign off now and get to work. But we'll see each other next week, and I'll probably be in contact with you anyway, because we have other things to talk about.
Okay.
Take care, folks. Bye-bye.
Thanks for a great class.
Thanks for your participation. Bye now.